Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's panel discussion. This is called Opening Schools in Hong Kong in the Time of COVID. My name is Sujata Visaria. I'm an associate professor of economics. I'm also one of the associate directors of the Center for Economic Policy here at HKUST. And this event is hosted by the Center for Economic Policy. This is a very new center, but one that we are very excited about. Our mission at this center is to inform economic policies and programs by providing high quality research insights. We have two research programs in the center at the moment. One, which is led by my colleague Siu Fai Liang, who's also here, is on antitrust and competition policy. It studies business strategies and laws and regulations related to competition and market structure. And the other, which I lead, is called Development Economics Action Research, which focuses on rigorous evaluation of policy interventions in developing countries. Now, today's panel is about neither of these two topics, but it is still about a very important policy matter in Hong Kong, and arguably one on which I think social scientists and educators can shed important light. And so we're very fortunate to have on our panel today, Mrs. Belinda Greer. She is the CEO of the English Schools Foundation here in Hong Kong. You may know that the ESF is the largest English medium international school organization in Hong Kong. It operates 22 schools across the city and also has a program of extracurricular activities. More than 18,000 students study at ESF schools. Mrs. Greer has been the CEO for nearly 8 years, she told me. She came to the ESF with more than 30 years of education related experience. She's been a school principal, she's been an inspector of schools, and most recently, she was the director of joint education services at Stirling and Clackmannanshire councils in Scotland. We're also very, very lucky to have our own Professor Hyuncheol Bryant Kim, who joined HKUST last year as an associate professor. Bryant has had an unusual career path. He started off as a medical doctor and then gave up his medical career to study public health, and then went on to get a PhD in economics at Columbia University, which is also my alma mater. Most recently, he was an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at Cornell. He studies health and education economics and has multiple publications in some of the best journals in economics. So today we will be talking about opening schools in Hong Kong in the time of COVID. And the way that we're planning to run this is more as a conversation. So my job is to ask questions, and Belinda and Bryant will share with us their expertise, their experience, and their thoughts on what Hong Kong has done and what Hong Kong could do in terms of school opening. Now, if you're in the audience and you would like to ask our panelists some questions, then please type your questions in the Q&A. And there's going to be time allocated to question and answers towards the end. Okay. Let's get started. I'm going to start us off by first putting Hong Kong's COVID response in a little bit of perspective. So as we all know, we're actually very fortunate to be in Hong Kong at this time because Hong Kong has been very, very successful in keeping case numbers low, and also conditional on cases, it's been good at keeping mortality low as well. But also we know that this has been accompanied by some very strict measures. So some of these are relatively innocuous, but still very effective, like the mask mandate. But there's also widespread testing, and there is quarantine. And most relevant to today's discussion, there is the closing of schools. So Hong Kong, as we know, closed schools early on in the pandemic. It has closed them repeatedly. It has kept them closed for long periods. And then when it has opened them, it has done this quite cautiously with lots and lots of guidelines in place. It's important to remember, I think, that Hong Kong probably still has vivid memories of the SARS crisis that happened in 2003. And I think it has been argued that those experiences have probably informed how the health authorities and how the government has responded to COVID as well. It also seems to inform how they respond to other health crises. For example, in Hong Kong, it is actually not uncommon for schools to be closed. Kindergartens, primary schools are often closed, for example, when there's a flu outbreak. But I think, you know, as we all recognize, COVID has been different. COVID is more transmissible than SARS was. It seems to be even more transmissible than the flu. It seems to be more deadly than the flu. It's possible for carriers to be asymptomatic, so people might not know that they're infected, but they might be spreading infection. But also, I think this pandemic has lasted way longer than the SARS did, or than a typical flu outbreak does. And I think this is important because when we're responding to something like this, I think our considerations probably need to change as time goes on. When schools are shut for a short period of time, I think that's possibly one thing, but when you're facing something that's going to be repeated, that's going to be continued over a long period of time, I think we might need to reconsider or think again, at least, what trade-offs are at play here and what choices we're making. So I want to start us off actually by asking Bryant something, and I'm asking Bryant now to put on his public health hat and tell us why would a government want to shut schools when you have a pandemic ongoing like the one that we're in?
Right. So before COVID-19, like shut down school could be one of the most effective way to prevent the spread of the diseases. For example, flu, like general flu, like these are very susceptible for the children. So like from the previous experience, it was a reasonable response to shut down in the beginning of the pandemic. But after quite a few months, we realized that children are not very susceptible, and also they're not likely to be more serious. So now we have much better understanding about the COVID-19. Then, I mean, it's already the policy should be modified. So in the beginning, it's totally understandable, but now if we keep the same policy, that's not reasonable at all.
Okay. So, but I mean, I think the rationale that the government was probably following in the beginning is that children could help to spread it. They could cause.
Exactly. So,
right.
Yeah, that is same for the flus and other infectious diseases.
Right. Okay. So actually, so we'll talk a little bit about what does the science now say about the chances that children spread COVID or that closing schools is effective. But I think it's also important to understand how schools respond when something like this hits them, right? So if I can ask Belinda, I imagine like many other school administrators must have realized sometime in January 2020, all of a sudden that schools were not about to open after Chinese New Year. I know that means we have to go online, but there are still many considerations and many choices that you have to make when you decide how you're going to do it and what you're going to do. So could you perhaps go back in your mind to that time and explain a little bit to us about what guided the ESF's decisions and how those considerations then changed as time went on?
Thanks, Sujata. Looking back, I think to say that 2020 has been a difficult year is to understate massively the unexpected events and the challenges that we've had to face over this year. You're absolutely right, Sujata. We do have experience of schools closing for flu or for 1 or 2 days because of typhoon, but we've never faced anything like this prolonged nature of the class suspension for the global pandemic. I think, however, I'd want to say up front that throughout this past year, our attention has stayed firmly focused on ensuring continuity of students' learning, and I think this is what served us well. But if I go back to February 2020, and you're absolutely right, the schools had just headed off for the Chinese New Year break. It came on the back of, if you recall, the social unrest in Hong Kong, and we were looking forward to starting what would be a fresh part of the term coming back, when we were given the heads up by EDB that it looked like there was going to be a class suspension. Now, the fact that it came on the back of the social unrest actually set us up in a really strong position, because we were much more equipped than we might have been, because we had contingency plans in place to ensure that learning would continue if the social unrest hadn't settled over the Chinese New Year. So we were able to immediately shift learning to online the first day back after Chinese New Year holiday. And we were able to then use the plans that we had in place for 2019 into 2020 to help us at the early part of COVID. And if I could just maybe share with you that there was 3 guiding principles that drove that plan, and they're quite simple, and they served us well in 2019, and this is what enabled ESF to open our keep the learning going, if you like, to continue the learning online when we had the immediate class suspension. And it's 3 areas, and it's the need to ensure, first and foremost, the safety and welfare of our students and staff. Secondly, to look at ways of continuity and progression in students' learning and their well-being. And then because we're an education system with 22 schools, and finding consistency where it matters across the system, while still being able to enable schools to make local decisions. So our whole driving force was from day one to ensure that learning continued, and we did that online. But I have to say the whole prolonged nature of the global pandemic has really tested that, and I'm sure I'll get a chance to say a little bit more about some of the things that we learned and some of the things that we had to adapt. So while we were well placed to keep learning going at the early days, we couldn't have just kept doing what we started off in February. We couldn't have done that for a whole year.
Right. Okay. Yes. I hope to find out more about sort of, how things changed as time went on, and also what it took for the ESF to pull off something like this, for what it takes any education institution really to just change overnight, to start providing online learning when you haven't really been doing that in a big way before. But before we get to that, Bryant, I totally agree with you, and I think most of us would, right? That we all think our children would be better off if they were physically in school. But I think many people are concerned that in a pandemic, what if sending kids to school actually makes things worse? So we talked about how students can be asymptomatic carriers. Right. People, I know I've spoken to parents who worry that their children don't really understand how grave the situation is and how important it is to kind of keep their masks on, for example, right? Or, what if sending my kids to school causes an outbreak, for example? And then there is often news that kind of heightens fears like that, right? So, for example, in May 2020, Israel opened its schools back up, and there was an outbreak in a high school within 10 days. Right. So there are people who worry about this sort of thing. And what would you say to people like that?
Right. So in order to understand the impact of school opening, reopening on the COVID-19 spread out, we must be able to understand that what's the consequences or what's the counterfactual, like what would have happened if we do not send our kids? Would it be possible for me to share the screen?
Yes,
but now,
please do.
Yes. So let me share one slide that everybody can see. So these are the figures. The figures when we the pictures when we send our kids and when we do not send our kids. So when the students go to the school, they if the school follows the guidelines pretty well, then all of the students wear the mask on it, and when they eat, there is some words here. That is the best scenario at school. But what if they don't go to the school? They probably go to their friend's house, or they play outside. There is no supervision, and when they meet their friends at home, it's obviously that they're not going to wear the mask. So the counterfactual says that if you understand what would have happened if they don't go to the school, they also face the risk of the COVID-19 infection. for us, there is no zero risk options. Like so, so except for the Israel, for other countries, there are a couple of studies to look at the COVID-19 cases after school opening, or other countries, except for the Israel, actually zero impact or even decreases the COVID-19 because school could be even safer. And even in the Israel, the COVID-19 instance increases because the schools are not ready for following the guidelines, the COVID-19 prevention guidelines, but there is no impact on the serious cases or mortality because the children usually have very mild symptoms or even like mostly no symptoms. So overall, if we understand what they would do if they do not go to school, then we can easily imagine school closure. There is no serious impact on COVID-19 spread out.
Right. So that's a really good point, that you have to not just look at opening schools versus closing schools in isolation, but you also have to think about what will the children be doing if they're not in school. And
right.
That's the counterfactual that you're talking about. Do you worry? I mean, there are new variants, for example, and some have argued that those are more transmissible among children. And the other thing also is that a child, you're pointing out that children don't get serious symptoms and don't fall very sick. But what if they give it to adults and those adults then end up being very sick?
Oh, that's true. But the new variant that is more transmissible and more the children are more vulnerable for these new variants, but they are vulnerable not only at school but also other places too. Okay. So if you still think about what would have happened, is that it's basically the same. Unless the parents are really strict and prevent them going out completely. Right. The COVID-19 instance risk is like everywhere. So schools, right. What I want to say is that school following the guideline, COVID-19 prevention guideline, would be the most safe option for the children.
Right. So you're saying, let's think about behavioral responses that children will have when you don't let them go to school. And if you take those into account, then they're actually safer in school.
Right.
And they would be outside. So it seems like it hinges a lot on having them safe in school, right? Right. Having all the safety protocols in place. Belinda, I imagine that opening up a school is a huge operation in the time of COVID. Can you just kind of help us understand a little bit what it takes to open a school and have students coming back?
From an ESF perspective, we have a crisis management team who meet at the centre, and our job is, on a daily basis, I have to be honest, early days, was to meet and to look at the safety guidelines from the Centre for Health and Protection. We had to look at all the school plans. We had to ensure that we had enough space for social distancing. And of course, EDB would have to approve all plans. So to start with, we were only allowed small numbers of students coming into school, and that has, I suppose, increased in time. But to actually get students into school has taken crisis management teams at school level, at ESF level. We've had to pull together plans that have been shared with EDB. We've had to obviously buy equipment, safety equipment, and then put in place new protocols. So when students arrive in school, we've had to put posters and spots on the floor to keep students apart. And then we've had to think through how do we ensure that the learning environment is conducive to the learning that we want to take place when students are having to be socially distanced. So what didn't work for ESF, and EDB worked closely with us to find a solution. We couldn't sit the children just face to back in rows because that's not how our children learn. So we had to find a way of using the environments. Our classrooms aren't set up in that way, that would ensure that children could still be kept safe and yet could still be in an environment in which they could learn. So we've invested, so much time, so much effort, increased resources just to ensure that the environment is safe for our students and for our staff.
And you've had to, so would you describe it as a dialogue that you've had to have with the EDB? Because, you know, there are so many different schools in Hong Kong, and some are more sort of the traditional, you know, I grew up sitting in a row, and, you know, many people still do sit in rows and face the blackboard. But so how does one have that? Is it a back and forth? Is it a dialogue?
Well, we have very good links with EDB at system level and at local school level. So our approach was for every school to pull together a plan. The principals met with me and the crisis management team on a weekly basis. So we all understood the different approaches across ESF, but each school had to look at their own context. And then they had to put together a very robust plan that came into our safety team at ESF Centre. We then shared that with EDB and they signed it off to ensure that we could bring children into school. It really was a massive logistical exercise for us just to physically get teachers and children in school.
And what about sort of how teaching changes? The whole mode of teaching has changed when you're sort of online. Some of the time you're in person, some of the time, right? For a while, students were coming in, I think, alternate days or every third day, or, I mean, it must be a huge ask of the staff who are delivering the teaching. And can you tell us a little bit about how that worked out?
Well, I mean, I would say we've certainly been on a journey. And I think early days online learning gave children lots of work to be working on independently at home. But we very quickly realized that, you know, of course, quality learning requires interaction between the teacher and the learner and feedback. And we quickly realized that with the prolonged nature, the likely prolonged nature, we couldn't just keep giving children more work to do without actually engaging with them and being able to assess what their next steps in learning should be. And that's what caused us a little bit of a headache at the start, if I'm being honest, because we were trying to keep the work going. So we had taken the work from the previous term, or the term up till Chinese New Year. We were trying to deliver these plans, but we were having to do it using online learning. And so we stopped in our tracks and we said, okay, let's do less, but we must have direct teaching every day for every child with their teacher. So Zoom was absolutely a lifeline for us. So every teacher was then able to connect with every child every day on Zoom and assess the child's understanding, as well as looking at what work they had completed, so that we could start to plan next steps. And that's been the big challenge, because, you know, face-to-face, working with children, you can assess their understanding in a way on Zoom you can't. And over a short period of time, you can give them work and, you know, they'll continue to make progress, but over a longer period of time, you need to be able to assess where children are and their understanding. And therefore, we had to start thinking differently about how we plan and how we interact and what we spend our time on. Now, I mean, I would say we've learned a lot, and there's things that we've learned from this experience that I think we can bring back into schools, and we can work differently in class with our students. But if I look at how we were delivering online learning in February, it's very different to how we were delivering online learning just now.
Right. And when, you know, it became possible for schools to open, sort of bring 100%, right? Students could come back 100%. Of course, it came with guidelines that you had to follow, despite the fact that the ESF seemed to have done quite well when it came to online learning. And you've described sort of all the learning and all the adaptation that went on. Despite all of that, I think the ESF was quite proactive in kind of taking that opportunity to bring students back in 100%. Can you tell us a little bit about the rationale and the considerations that went into that?
Yeah, I mean, education is a social activity, and the one thing that's really been amplified is the need for us to be together and to have the social interaction. Education's not just about learning facts. So what we understood from both a student as well as a teacher, and I have to say a parent's perspective, everybody just wanted children back in school. We were all agreed about that. We could see that online learning, as you say, Sujata, had served us well, but we just felt with Zoom fatigue, with the need for us to really reconnect properly with the learners. We had to do absolutely everything possible to get as many children into school for as long as possible. EDB was being ultra cautious, and we had 1/6 capacity, and then that was increased to 1/3. And the day that they announced that they were increasing the 1/6 to 1/3, so we could use the same plans, but we could look to bring in more students, he said that if we were prepared to have every single member of staff tested, then we could have 100% in. And so from our perspective, it was well worth the effort of putting in place testing to get 100% of students in every day. If I share with you that for some students, 1/3 capacity meant they were in school for 5 morning sessions in a 3-week period. 5 sessions in a 3-week period, that is not enough. So I'm going to be very honest and say it wasn't easy, that we had some staff members who were very concerned about being tested every 14 days. We had the biggest concern being quarantine. Was this going to increase the risk of facing quarantine? But we also had some staff who were concerned about data privacy, and would the tests be used for something else. So ESF took the decision to have a private vendor manage all our tests, and we have been able to protect each individual. We don't use Hong Kong ID numbers, we use our own employee number, and we have now had 3 test cycles, and we've been testing 3,500 staff each time. And that has enabled us to bring 100% of students in, half days still, but every day. And we believe it's worth doing. It's worth the added cost, and it's worth the effort, because we believe it's really important to get our children into school every day.
Thank you. That's an impressive effort that it takes. Bryant, were you saying something?
Right. Yeah. Can I I'm so glad that the ESF convinced the teachers and try to 100% attendance rate. This is wonderful, and I think this is also supported by the scientific evidence that the recent paper shows that as far as the students wear the mask, the chance of infection is exactly the same, 1 meter, between 1 meter and 2 meter social distancing. So like 2 meter and 1 meter, these are not different, but the most important factor is the ventilation. So as far as we have a good ventilation at the classroom, and wear the mask 1 meter, even shorter than 1 meter, doesn't matter that much. So that basically could support 100% attendance in the classroom. Another thing I'd like to point out is that I'm also super glad that the teachers in ESF, they really want to have the students at school, not just because of the learning, but also because of the social interaction. Because the impact of education is not only for the cognitive skills, but also non-cognitive skills. And the many research shows that there is huge impact not only cognitive ability, but also non-cognitive ability, and there are complementarity between these two. So this is really great. And some other research shows that that is in Germany and Australia. They have a very interesting setting that some students, they found a huge decreases on cognitive learning during the COVID-19 period, but there is some improvements when they successfully implement the online teaching, Zoom teaching, but it's only 30%. So Zoom teaching, as we all know, it is very difficult to be as effective as the face-to-face teaching, and the study shows that basically it compensates only 30% of the 30% of the learning. Maybe social interaction is 0, so it doesn't have anything about the social interaction. So what ESF is doing is basically also supported by the scientific evidence, recent evidence. Thank you.
For that, Brian, can I just say, Sujata, that, you know, I absolutely agree with what you've said, and certainly what the principals are reporting back to me is the need for teachers now to spend more time looking at social skills, giving the students time to work in groups, because they've really missed not having those opportunities whilst we've been working online. So they're seeing the soft skills as requiring additional time, as well as looking at keeping the learning going. So getting students back into school has been a big positive step for us. I mean, I have to say, it happened at the weekend that we had the big gym outbreak on the island, which was just as well it happened just ahead of us bringing all our students back, because it did impact our schools. Actually, it just showed everyone that the threat of being impacted by COVID was out there in the community, not because we were testing our teachers. And therefore we did have, you know, schools impacted that weekend, and the first week we tried to get all our students back. And we were under a bit of pressure from people who thought, well, now that we've had the gym outbreak, maybe wait to bring, and we said, no, all the schools that can bring children in, that's what we must do. And we've just pushed ahead with that. And we've been able to get all of our schools open with 100% of the kids in for half days.
Oops.
I think Sujata is frozen for some reason. Maybe we can take a couple of the questions from the Q&A. One question was that the description of the reopening, this is from Haijing, seemed to require the school to do a lot. Did the Hong Kong government provide subsidies to schools to make all of these changes that were required, or did you have to figure out a way to finance yourself, and were there trade-offs?
No, we had to finance it ourselves, and I mean, we problem solved it ourselves, but that was our choice. And EDB would engage with us, and if we wanted to do something that they said they didn't think was safe, we then worked with them, or indeed with the Centre for Health Protection. We have very close links with them too, to enable us to be able to put, I suppose, the measures in place that would allow us to offer education the way that we want to. But no, we didn't get any funding from government to do this.
And I was wondering myself, what are the current problems you're facing? The biggest problem, headaches you still feel are really hard to solve right now, given what's happening, or complaints or concerns by various stakeholders that are troubling to people, if any?
I mean, I think we just want to have students in 100%. So I think just now, the requirement to only have students in for half days, that's still impacting on what we can do. I mean, we're finding ways around that. We're actually prioritising teaching so that we make best use of the time that students are in class. And this has been one of the, I suppose, the benefits of what we found from working in the way that we are. So teachers, for example, understand that every minute counts, and therefore, if there are things that students can be doing at home on their own independently, get them to do that, so that when they're in the classroom working with you, that you make best use of the time that's there. So sort of front loading the learning, so that the approaches that we've been taking, we've been reviewing, and we've been starting to change what it looks like, because we've only got children in front of us for such a short period of time. So that's something that I know that parents are still really frustrated about. They want their children in school full time. And let me think. Well, examinations, we've got kids that are preparing for their exams, and certainly what students are telling me is that some of the pressure's been taken away from them because some exams are cancelled, some are going ahead, so they've got a bit of a mixed bag this year. Last year they were all cancelled, but just ensuring that the students get, you know, recognition for their achievements, that's going to be really important to us. And I suppose any regrets that I would have is that for our graduating class, they're not getting the experience that, you know, most students would have. So one of the schools got in touch with me this morning to say today will be the last day that year 13s will be in school because they're going on study leave. And the school's looking to have a day in the next few months where the students can come in and be the only students in the school so they can get to say farewell. So there are things that I feel the students themselves are very resilient, they bounce back, but there are experiences that I feel that they've missed out on that most other years we would have provided for students. So we hope that we can find ways of making that up.
Okay, back to you, Sujata. Are you ready to take over again? You're muted. Maybe not.
Yes. Okay. How about now?
Yes, you're okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Albert. We're having technical difficulties. A year into the pandemic, we haven't quite solved this yet. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit actually to Bryant about this very interesting thing that's happened in Hong Kong, which Belinda mentioned, is that when you want to bring in students to school 100%, then all staff have to be tested every 14 days, right? And we have very strict quarantine rules in Hong Kong, which of course you can understand completely the scientific rationale for. But then what people often fear is that not so much that they will get COVID, but they fear that they will test positive or they will be close contacts and then they'll have to go into quarantine, which seems to be like not what the government would want, right? That is not the government's intention. They would like people to get tested. If people are positive, they would like them to isolate. But then if the costs of testing positive are so high, then even well-meaning people who want the students to come back to school, for example, are just now going to be really scared about getting tested, which is the opposite of what you want. So it seems like an unintended outcome.
Exactly.
And what is your take, Bryant, on that? And do you have any suggestions for what one could do?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree that the government largely ignores the behavior responses, behavior consequences of the putting the very high costs of the COVID-19 positive. Like if you find that you have to stay ugly places for 2-3 weeks without nice food, then if your personal cost increases, if you get test positive, you really do not want to get tested. Like that applies not only for ESF teachers, but general population, including me. So as Sujata, you mentioned that, right, that basically, if the personal cost of the being positive, COVID-19 positive is high, then people are not willing to take the COVID-19 test. So I don't think it's a good idea to put them in the facility. Like if it's a positive, then they can be at home, right? And there's a trust issue. There is the minor trust issue, but I believe that the stay at home, that should be enough to incur. I mean, if it is a facility 2 weeks, 3 weeks without internet, that's totally not wise. Not a wise policy.
And Belinda, you have obviously had to really think hard about what it means when all of your staff get tested every 14 days. So it's not just staff, but even students face the risk that they might have to go into quarantine if they test positive or if they're close contacts. What is the ESF's perspective on this?
Well, I mean, we've taken the stance that the risk of quarantine is there in the environment, which, the previous point I made about the gym outbreak showed that we had staff and we had parents get caught up in that. And therefore testing, we were challenged by some staff who said, what's the science behind testing staff if you're not testing students and doing it every 14 days? And we've taken the position that this is a requirement from EDB to enable us to have 100% in. Therefore, that's why we're doing it. And whether the science makes sense or not, it's a requirement, and therefore we will do this. The fear of quarantine, you know, for parents, their fear is that their children will be taken into quarantine, and you know, what we've worked closely with the Centre for Health and Protection to look at what that means for our students. And we've only had a very small number of students in ESF that faced quarantine, and it was on the back of the gym outbreak on Hong Kong Island. And because we have very tight child protection policies, and we wanted assurance that safeguarding protections were in place, arrangements were made that each of the children could have a parent go with them. So the parents went with the children. Now, luckily for them, it was only for a few days. It wasn't 14 days, it was for a few days, and it was in a government registered hotel.
Right.
So we were only impacted by a small number, but the one area that we've been pushing the Centre for Health and Protection is to really give us the assurance that we need, that the standards that we have in our schools to protect our children is in place.
Right, right.
Biggest concern for parents.
It's a huge concern for parents. That makes a lot of sense. The other thing I think that is also very important for us to recognize is that when we talk about schooling in Hong Kong, there's actually tremendous diversity in what schools are like and what schools can do. And I think maybe yours is, you know, best practice, perhaps, what the ESF has managed to achieve. But different schools have different ability to provide online schooling. They might not have the resources. They might not have the equipment. Students are also, you know, more or less equipped. Some are more, some are less to learn online. And, you know, I'm not just talking about personality differences among students, but also access to technology, to the internet, to a quiet space even where they can take online lessons. So Bryant, I know you've written an article in the South China Morning Post where you're arguing that when you shut down schools, you're actually worsening inequality. Could you perhaps explain to us a little bit what the argument is that you're making there?
Right. Yeah. So when the school closed, then maybe the only way to learn is online. But the poorer students, poorer family, they are less likely to have a better internet access. They're less likely to have the tablet PCs. The number of tablet PCs you need should be the same to the number of children you have. So it's not even for my family. The number of tablet PCs is not like less than less than the number of my kids. So for these families, there is no way to learn. So that is the biggest thing. Another thing is that the poorer family, they are less likely to have a person who could supervise during the daytime. Like especially young children, they need some supervision during the Zoom teaching, right? But they don't have such a person. They cannot hire these people. So that would intensify the inequality in education achievement.
Right. And there is some research coming out from the US, for example, that shows that students are falling behind in reading. They're falling behind in maths. On the one hand, I don't think it's quite clear yet whether we should think of this as a long-term permanent sort of damage that cannot be overcome, or whether we think that it's temporary and it can be overcome. There's also debates about whether, you know, just looking at something like reading and math scores is sort of missing the bigger picture in terms of, you know, what have students lost here in this year. Belinda, what is your perspective on this? You're obviously the CEO of the ESF, but you've also got past experience from being an administrator.
Yep. Well, I think, Sujata, when you said that, it's understanding what children have lost. So it's understanding the impact on every learner from the point that they're at today. If I could go back to a few points that were made about access to learning. ESF families face the same pressures, not having laptops that go around up for every child for themselves as well. And we were able to share equipment, so we made sure that every child had what they required. However, there was still pressure on families. Parents were working, they were at home. Children themselves started to, the novelty factor of coming on Zoom started to wear thin. So even although we have worked hard to have systems in place, there are children who, if we're being honest, there are some children who have absolutely thrived online. They've found a voice. They didn't have the voice in the classroom, they've come online, and it's just been the right environment for them. But there are many other children who just haven't engaged to the same level. And the point you're making about understanding the impact on every child is what's important. So, you can do test scores and that will tell you so much. But what we're doing with our children as we're bringing them, reintroducing them in full time, is to really find out where children are in their learning. There's important, particularly if you go to early years, there's important stepping stones in learning that we want to make sure that children have had that proper experience. So if we're looking at how children learn to read, they've had a different experience. So let's look and let's make sure we assess their understanding so that we're building on a strong understanding, and that we're not either taking children back, and it's not about teaching a program, it's about adjusting our program, but to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the learner. So that critical assessment of where every child is in their learning, in their understanding, given the disruption that's been there, is critical for us moving forward. And I can see that as a big positive, in that, in some ways it's disrupting how teachers are planning their classes and thinking about learners. And great opportunity for us to start to transform how we organise ourselves. We are very fortunate that we have a support for students team at the centre that supports all of the schools. We've got educational psychologists, we've got counsellors and coaches, and we are spending time now thinking through what kind of safety net can we put in place? How can we support students to make sure that their learning continues from the point that they're at, but we recognise if there are any areas of weakness, or if there's been a gap, how are we going to ensure that that child is supported? So for me, it's a challenge, but I think it's a great benefit for the organisation to be looking newly at how we do this.
Right. So you see this as changing how you will do things going forward.
Yeah.
So creating permanent change, you think?
Yeah, I think there's always a risk that, particularly in high performing schools and schools where students themselves are keen to learn and parents support their children, that you can start to teach the curriculum, and the one thing in ESF we talk about, we teach children, we don't teach the curriculum, we don't teach the IB, we teach children, we use the IB, and this really has amplified the importance of that. So our teachers are not teaching the year 3 course or the English course, our teachers are teaching the students in their class, and they're finding ways of ensuring that the understanding and the learning that's taken place over these past 12 months, that's secure.
Fantastic. So would you have advice for somebody else that was having to deal with this situation?
Look after your teachers. I think that our teachers have done an incredible job, and I don't underestimate the effort that's gone into working in the way that they have, because they've had to be agile, they've had to be flexible. We've certainly been very challenging, and we've not accepted the status quo. We've continuously pushed to find ways of ensuring high quality learning no matter what. And when I go on, because I get invited to visit some lessons, when I go and see some of the innovative approaches and what the teachers have been able to do online, it's absolutely amazing. The biggest challenge they found was working across two modes. So when they had some students in class and then they were having to do some online, I think having all the students in has re-energized. It's re-energized the teaching, and I think the students themselves are pleased to be back and chance to socialise with friends. So I would say if anyone was asking, you know, for advice, make sure the teachers are supported. Look at the planning, make sure that the teachers have all the equipment they need. The one thing we said at the start was, you know, the responsibility is for every member of staff, including me, to make sure we have the equipment that we need to be able to work from home if that's what happens, if things have to shift to home. So everybody has to be prepared and ready to work from home or in school, for teachers to have, if not certainty, clarity of what's expected of them.
Belinda, can I ask one quick question? Right. So I'm curious that whether ESF has a plan to analyze the students, like who are missing the most, who are most affected over the like pandemic period, and what is the determinant that affects the loss of the learning, right? So like some students they may keep the same learning, but some students may be more affected. And I really want to understand what's the determinant. Is that the socioeconomic status? Is the number of tablet PCs they have? Is that whether they have a good nannies to help them or not? Like there are many factors that affect the amount of the loss of the learning. If we have a better figure, then we may be able to address better. And is there any plan or way to do that?
Bryant, are you asking me about us at ESF looking at the conditions for learning at home and during that period to see if we can identify what's been successful or not?
Right. Yeah. At least we have to measure. We must be able to measure their achievement before and after the COVID-19 and their surroundings, their conditions, and which are the most important factors that affect their learning, like something like that. If we understand better, then we can make the recovery plan, better recovery plan. So yeah. That's the question. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we haven't started to research the different conditions. I suppose we asked parents to provide the conditions that we felt were important for children to be able to work at home and to engage. For the assessments, what's interesting is, you know, the children who need the most support, in some ways they've continued to make the progress that we might have expected, because they have, on the whole, and thinking about some of our children with the most complex needs, they've had to be supported to actually engage online. So that has continued. But it's still early days for us to see if you know, the context that somehow people are falling behind. You know, and I suppose it's working out, well, what is it if it's a program or a syllabus you fall behind, but if it's learning, how are we going to assess where children are in their understanding? Something like reading's quite easy for us to look at, in that, you know, teachers teaching maybe a year 2 would be able to say most children by this time in the year would be working at this level, and whether the class now are able to do that or not. I suppose what's been really interesting for me is the fact that the schools have assessed children's resilience and social skills and their confidence. And how that's what started to come to the fore when children started to come back, and teachers see this as being really important to almost sort of socialise children back into working collaboratively in class, in groups. So I suppose, Bryant, I'm not really answering your question, but I'm saying I think there's a lot of work for us to do. Our priority is looking at individual children and making sure that on the back of the past 12 months that we're giving them a really good experience now that ensures that they continue to make progress. And if there are any gaps, it's not about taking children back, but ensuring that we don't just march on regardless. We're not teaching the curriculum or a syllabus, we're teaching children, and we need to make sure that they're secure in the skills that we know are really important.
Fantastic. We have just 4 minutes left before we should end, and I'd like to end on time. Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask from the panelists or even from the audience? I'm looking in the Q&A and I'm not seeing anything yet, but feel free to type it away.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. There's one from our colleague Young, and so she says she's an ESF parent, and she thanks Belinda for all the efforts pivoting from online learning, but she also feels that she's noticed there's a lot of differences across schools in how they deliver the online teaching, and was wondering if there are any efforts to coordinate resources so that, for instance, schools' online learning materials can be shared with other schools, or there's learning across schools without, reducing the incentives of all of the teachers to be developing new materials.
I think Albert, that, I mean, and thank you very much to the parent for thanking us. I mean, I have to say the parents have been amazing, and without the support of parents, we couldn't have achieved what we have. The parents have been absolutely amazing. It's really interesting working in an education system where, we talk about subsidiarity and local decisions and schools being empowered to be able to make the right decision for their context, for their parents, for the students, for their teachers. And yet, being part of ESF, there is real power in the collective. So, early on in our discussion, I spoke about the 3 principles that drove us to ensure that we were delivering well for students during the global pandemic, and before that, social unrest. And the third point, if you recall, was about consistency where it matters. And I think the parents are right to say that the consistency should be in the quality, and that their child should be getting the same level and standard as any child in any school in ESF. Do we always get it right? No, we don't. I'm first to put my hands up and say that, getting consistency across 22 schools for 18,000 children all of the time is a big challenge, but we're not complacent. And it's something that, I said earlier that I meet with the principals on a weekly basis. Now that's unusual. Up until 2020, I wouldn't have been meeting with principals in small groups for an hour every week. And part of that was to get the consistency, because what doesn't work is if I decide as CEO, this is what's to happen across the organization and just expect everyone to do it. That's not going to be as effective as working closely with the principals, who work closely with their teachers and support staff to bring about the change and to make sure we're delivering well for every child. So, I'm aware that, some parents were very happy with the level of learning. I have to say the inconsistency within a school often is greater than across the schools. So you can start to compare teachers and classes. But I think, we haven't given up. We'll continue to work hard to make sure the child gets the very best that we can offer. Great question. Thanks, Albert.
Sujata, can I ask one final question?
Please go ahead.
Because, we read about a lot of conflicts where schools want, the school districts or the local governments want schools to open, but then the teachers unions oppose, and there's really disagreement. I'm just wondering if you sent disagreements across principals in other schools or different parts of the government that you feel kind of have been the sources of difficulty in terms of coming to policies that everyone's happy with. What have been the pressure points kind of in the discussions?
Albert, that's a great question. And can I say that, to put in place testing for almost 4,000 staff hasn't been easy. And getting to the point of making the decision, we had to bring the principals with us. We had to take account of the views of staff. We have a teachers union in ESF, so we met with the teachers union. We also met with school council chairs, and I suppose how we managed to position this was very much looking at what's in the best interests of our students. What do we all agree? What do we actually need? And everybody was agreed that we need to get students back into school. Once we decided that that was the goal, that's what we wanted, we then looked at, is it reasonable to ask people to be tested every 14 days in order to be able to achieve this? Once we took the decision that we felt it was reasonable, then we went with that decision. I have to say that, you know, there was mixed views. We had a petition that supported it. We had a petition that didn't support it and attacked the first petition. And the petitions actually, whilst they gave us valuable feedback, that did not influence our decision. Our decision to ask staff to be tested every 14 days in order for us to get every child in was based on what we believed was absolutely critical for children's learning at this point in time.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank again Bryant and Belinda. We've learned a lot, I think, and hopefully going forward, we won't have to discuss this anymore because schools will just open 100%. Kids will be there, and we won't have to think about this.
Right, but we shouldn't close the school again if the COVID-19 cases increases. That COVID-19 cases should have happened otherwise. So that's the main purpose of the discussion today.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Bryant.
Thank Jackie.
Thank you.
Bye.